Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. This is the first Monday webinar for PSG Consulting. It's Monday, October the 2nd, and we're pleased to have you with us. If you would please make note that the chat is closed to the audience. We'll be using it to post announcements. Your participation is welcome, and so we ask you to please post your questions and comments to the Q&A. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Paige Gardner, who is our host for today.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for joining. The two panelists today will speak to issues that not only have so much relevance today, but also have confronted civilizations and any civic society. In the American context, one of the challenges is how do we remain faithful to the ideals and aspirations of our founding principles and values, while at the same time recognizing and coming to grips with, at times, a barbaric past that still haunts and shortchanges us culturally, politically, and economically. So much is at stake in this reckoning. Status threats, conflicting narratives about idealized versions of ourselves, the disservice of the mythology of rugged individualism, and much more. Our first speaker, Dr. Robert Jones, is the president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute. His new book, hold on, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, is really a must-read. He brilliantly traces our past with its soaring ideals and brutal history to the present with a unique understanding and a clear-eyed vision of how we integrate the disparate and contradictory elements of the American experiment into a richer future. Another vexing and ongoing challenge centers upon conversations, narratives, and dialogues. We all have experienced this in our personal lives, but as a society that is rapidly diversifying, how do we handle difficult conversations among people with different histories, perspectives, and narratives to create a shared understanding of one's humanity and then a shared vision of the future society in which we all seek to prosper? This is the work of Rachel Wahl, an associate professor at the University of Virginia, who has studied this as a part of her work with UVA students. Her work is so instructive on this measure. These difficult conversations, when held honestly, can reveal important insights and sobering conclusions about the challenges we face in a country that was founded, in history's telling, by immigrants. Yet the country has struggled to incorporate each generation of new people and their cultures, as well as refusing to recognize those who preceded us all. Let me start with Robert.
Hi, everybody. Well, thank you for having me, Paige, and Dr. Wahl, happy to be here with you as well. I do want to say it's always dangerous to ask somebody to talk about a book right after it's been published, because it's a challenge, I think, to do it concisely, but I'm going to do my best to do that, and just mostly just give you, kind of an overview of what I'm up to in the book. I've just got a couple of slides that I will share real quickly that just kind of serve as some little placeholders to kind of help us out here. So the book is called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. I'm a religious studies scholar by training, sociologist in terms of methodology. But actually in this book, I'm doing a lot more history than I typically do, because I really found that what I was wanting to do is to really trace back where this entanglement of the idea of kind of the superiority of European civilization, the superiority of Christianity over other religions, where does this kind of connect to our history? And the book was really motivated, I think, by the things that we're all familiar with, and mostly the fact that my day job, I run Public Religion Research Institute, and we do a lot of public opinion polling around issues. And pay attention to the kind of fault lines, cultural fault lines, religious fault lines, political fault lines. And it became clear to me, over the last decade that more and more we were fighting over, or fighting less about policy issues and more about identity issues. So our arguments were bigger and deeper than how we were going to solve X, Y, or Z policy problem, and they tended to be around these big questions of who is the country for, and who are we as Americans. And history really came to the fore, I think, as kind of the battleground of many of our fault lines. So the book is trying to make sense of that context, and really tracing it back. And we've had a one little vignette here. I'll give you a taste of the framing. We've had a big backlash between two dates in American history, 1776 versus 1619, over the last few years. The 1619 project, really challenging this idea that that image that one might have of 1776 of a bunch of all white men sitting in a room in Philadelphia or awkwardly posed around a table with their quill pens, is the beginning story of America. And that challenge was to provide a very different image. And that image was, if you remember the original New York Times publication of the 1619 project, it was of an ocean, and the story was actually a single ship, and it wasn't the Mayflower, right? It was actually a ship that was bringing Africans who had been kidnapped from their homelands and were destined for enslavement in the early colony of Virginia in the British colonies. And if we it was really the sense of, what is in that beginning frame, what is in the beginnings controls and sets the tone for what we tell about the rest of our story. And so it was this very significant challenge there. But as I was looking at kind of our longer history, I realized that that it was like such an important move to move us from 1776 to 1619. And there was still a century of European contact with indigenous people that was still not in the frame if we stop there. So part of the work of the book is to kind of back us up. And I argue that we should go back at least to 1493 in the book. Now, that's not 1492, the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as many of us were taught in elementary school, but it's the next year. And what happens there is that Columbus actually returns to Spain, and he asks for more ships, more supplies, more missionaries, more soldiers. But he also asks for a specific moral mandate to justify the colonizing efforts he's about to go on. And he reaches that, he gets that from the closest thing to international law that existed at the time, and that's the Catholic Church. And there had been developing across the last half of the 15th century a set of ideas that became to be called the doctrine of discovery. Now, this is something, as a religious studies scholar, gives a PhD in religion, I'd heard of, but I really didn't know much about it. It never was presented as anything that significant. But the more that I read indigenous scholarship, actually, and thought about it, the more I've come to see the importance of this thing called the doctrine of discovery. And essentially, it was this doctrine that came to be developed from the highest authorities, from the kind of papal edicts in the 15th century, that essentially was a way of dealing with this dilemma of what European responsibility was for these previously undiscovered people. And it was, a complex set of doctrines, but it boiled down to some fairly simple ideas, or actually one simple idea. And it turns out that the dividing line that they came up with, or the criteria they came up with, was to ask, are these people Christian? And if the answer was no, then they were to be considered, and this is like from the document, enemies of Christ. And that gave them the Europeans the rights then to seize their land, seize their goods. And if they resisted, it actually gave them the right to kill them, or in the words of the documents, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. So if we take that seriously as the way that the moral compass was set for Europeans coming to this country, I think it actually helps make sense of this kind of long competing tradition that we've had that is in direct competition with the idea of America as a pluralistic democracy, right? We cannot both be a kind of promised land for European Christians and a pluralistic democracy at the same time. So in the book, I show that like these ideas are actually still with us in many ways in what we're today calling white Christian nationalism. But in fact, these ideas are very, very old. It can be traced back, before the beginning of the country. And we asked in a public opinion survey, so how many people still believe this idea? And it turns out that it is an agree or disagree question that said, do you agree or disagree that America was destined by God to be a promised land for European Christians, where they could set an example for the rest of the world. And 30% of Americans agree with that statement. And it turns out that there's two groups in which a majority agrees with that statement, and those are self-identified Republicans and white evangelical Protestants. So one of the reasons why I think this old thing is at the center of some of our identity crisis and our big political fights is because it's come to have a majority hold on one of our two political parties. And again, it's not new; it's something very, very old. But the second part of the book, what I wanted to do is actually to go in and to take a look at three contemporary communities that were actually wrestling with these ideas and wrestling between this idea of a promised land for European Christians versus a pluralistic democracy. So I went to Mississippi, to Minnesota, and to Oklahoma, and spent time with folks there that were working to reckon with acts of really white racial violence and this legacy of indigenous genocide and forced removal, and trying to tell a different story about the country. And I think if I'm finding any hope there, I'll kind of end on this note, make sure we leave time for discussion. But, where I find some hope, I think, is and these are not easy places, like the rural Delta in Mississippi, Oklahoma, which is the only state in which every county voted for former President Trump, so a very red state, and then also upstate Minnesota in Duluth as well. But what I found is that there were these groups of people, everyday Americans, who really just finally decided they wanted to tell the truth about this challenging history as it happened on the ground. And then they wanted to do that as a way of kind of allowing kind of really their kids and their kids' kids to move forward together with a shared foundation of truth telling that could lead them to repair the damage that's been done by the kind of our really violent past and the racial violence that so divided us in the past. So I will land the plane there and hand it over to Dr. Wahl.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we're just not in slideshow mode yet.
Okay, I just have to get that running. All right. So can you see it now?
Yep, looks great. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I'm going to start today by giving you a kind of sneak preview. Usually we start with a big introduction and overview, but I'm just going to let you know what question I'm asking and how I answer it in my research, which is essentially, what good, if any, can it do to get people in a room together who disagree about politics? And my answer is that we have to differentiate between good in terms of changing institutions or developing bipartisan collaboration, and good when it comes to changing relationships. And we also have to distinguish between the kind of good that can come from changing what one thinks of politics and the kind of good that can come from changing what one thinks of the people on the other side of politics. And my answer is that if we are focused on changing relationships and what one thinks of the people on the other side of political issues, that there's actually a lot of good that can come from even just a one-time conversation in which people who disagree about political issues are brought together, depending on the context and how the conversation is moderated. Okay, so now I'm going to do the normal thing of backing up and giving you some intro and context. So as Professor Jones wisely noted, we have become accustomed to thinking in terms of what is often thought of as culture wars in our country, that we're fundamentally divided on questions of, as he put it, who the country is for and how we should live together. But it's also become very clear that we're divided not only on these questions themselves, but also on whether and how we should talk to people who disagree with us on these questions. For some people, civic conversations are what is needed to save our democracy, while for other people, these conversations are actually themselves tools of oppression that are deepening injustice. So why are these conversations potentially deepening injustice? Well, There are worries about these conversations in general in public settings, as well as more specifically when these conversations happen in schools, such as colleges and universities, which is what I'll be looking at today. And the worries about these conversations in schools are really the same as the worries about them happening anywhere, but intensified because we're talking about students. So critics of these conversations worry that students from dominant groups will sound more rational because of the vocabulary that they use, the cadence of their speech, because their experiences mirror the experiences of dominant adults. Therefore, they're going to appear more rational, even if they're not. They worry conversely that students from underrepresented groups, again, because of the cadence of their speech, the vocabulary they use, their cultural reference points, because of their experiences and the way they don't align with dominant groups' common sense and experiences, will appear to be less rational because of those signifiers, even if they're not. And also, people worry that these conversations, if we encourage them in schools, colleges, as well as in the general public, are going to blur what should be really important, clear lines of right and wrong. In other words, we should be encouraging people and students to fight injustice, not nuance everything eternally so that nobody has a clear sense of what we should be fighting for in this country. So these are some of the worries that we have about conversations taking place in the general public, as well as specifically in schools across lines of political difference. So in the research I'm sharing today, I observed dialogues between politically opposed college students. Many of these dialogue sessions took place in the Northeast, particularly around states in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, as well as students who were in surrounding nearby areas, as well as the University of Virginia. I observed these conversations between 2017 and 2019 and conducted in-depth semi-structured interviews with students shortly after their dialogue experience, and then again, for most of them 3 years later in 2020. So what good is derived? Back to that sneak preview of what I found out. I found that nobody changed their views of political issues as a direct result of these conversations, but almost everybody shifted in their views of the people on the other side of these issues. And they shifted in roughly 3 ways. One was personalization. So the sense that this person is a distinct individual who I can see apart from my idea, my general idea of the other. Now, this may not seem like a very significant shift, but as we know, in the polarization of geography, neighborhood, schools, and even grocery stores, very few of these students had regular relationships with people who had voted for a different presidential candidate than them. So this was pretty significant for many of them. So for example, Sally, who was a conservative Christian student, when I asked her, what was that experience like for you attending that dialogue? She said, it changes how I view the opposing side. It puts a face to it. It gives me someone I know. The second way students shifted was in recognizing that people on the other side, even if they thought they were completely wrong, actually had good intentions. They were well-intentioned. They were not motivated by hatred or cruelty or ignorance, but actually by something they could recognize as a moral source. So for example, Alan, who is a secular liberal student, said, at times when I read the 3 people in my news feed that are super pro-Trump, I'm livid, so mad at these people, so disgusted by these people. It's very easy for me to write on Facebook, any idiot who supports this immigration ban is a total idiot, or something like that kind of icky crap that you read on Facebook. What I really liked about this dialogue is I sat with these 4 innocent little Christian kids, and I realized they weren't very engaged with the stuff we were trying to figure out. They certainly weren't monsters. They certainly didn't deserve to be called fascists or assholes or idiots or Nazis or whatever. I do think that that empathy is huge. So he doesn't respect their reasoning. He calls them innocent, says they weren't very engaged with this stuff, but he does see that they're well-intentioned, that they're not fascists or idiots or monsters. Now, the third way that some students changed, and this was the least common and the most demanding, was seeing not only that they're an individual person, and not only that the other students mean well, but also that there's some soundness to their ethics, even though they don't agree with it. So, for example, another liberal student who was actually sitting at the same small table talking to the same conservative students that the previous student was talking about said, they morally could not vote for Hillary because of her stance on abortion. As they said, they're picking the lesser of two evils. For them, based upon their faith, that was Trump. And I connected with them because they were fully informed based upon all the policies. But they voted based upon what was important to them, so their faith. For me, someone who's very socially liberal, that's what I did previously with Obama. I was happy to see that they were struggling with it too, that it wasn't just me personally, but Christians as well did not vote for Trump easily. Their battle was the same as my battle. Now, when I interviewed students 3 years later, it was this kind of shift that lasted. Often students didn't remember really what they had talked about. What they remembered was the decency of the other side, that they sat with someone who was conservative or was liberal or who was on the left, and they were a nice person. They asked good questions. They were respectful. That's really what stayed with people. Now, for some students, life experiences shifted over time their political views. And in that case, when that happened, they often saw the dialogue as a first time that they had begun asking themselves questions about why they believe what they believe, so that when life experience shifted them, they were reflective and had a source from which to start to consider the ramifications of what it meant for their political views. So, for example, Sally says, when I interviewed her 3 years later and I asked her, do you ever think about that conversation? She said, I do think about that conversation specifically a lot. And just that question of, if you believe this, why are you voting the way you are? So the conversation was seen in retrospect as a first time when students began asking themselves questions about why they believe as they do, why their political identity is as it is. Now, as you remember, critics have a lot of concerns about these kinds of conversations, one of them being whether it will actually weaken political commitments and therefore willingness to participate in democracy, which would be a bad outcome, I think. What I found is that these conversations tended not to put students into a state of paralysis where everything seemed so nuanced that we can't make any decisions. On the contrary, it actually appeared to clarify and deepen their commitments through giving them a chance to, again, reflect on why they believe this and have to explain it to somebody else. So I really didn't see a muddying of the waters of political commitment, but more often than not, a clarifying of it. However, I did see that these conversations were disproportionately excruciating and challenging for structurally vulnerable students. And by that, I mean students whose rights were contested by policy proposals of the other side. So for example, this is a student whose family had immigrated from a Muslim majority country after then President Trump had declared a Muslim ban. She says, it's tough because they made the dialogue into games, and she's referring to the icebreakers at the beginning of the event. It allowed for a lot of giggling and trying to have fun when it was a very serious issue for some people in the room. That was hard because there were all of these emotions of, this is affecting me already. And you could imagine that it would be impossible to separate an ethical interpersonal interaction from politics when you're talking to people who essentially voted against your right to be in the room, right? And many students in this category felt this way, such as a queer student who was worried about what a Trump-appointed court could do to her marriage rights. So what do we take away from this? For one, I think we can see that dialogue is not just a tool of democracy, but it is its mirror image. It has all of the virtues and vices of democracy. It's very unreliable as a mechanism to secure any particular vision of justice. And it provides the possibility for the expression of minority views, while at the same time making that expression hardest for people who are minoritized. So what do we do with this? Well, I think practically we can design these conversations to be particularly responsive to people, and particularly in this case, students who are minoritized in the room. And there are a couple of different ways that we can do this. One of them is by finding out before the conversation, such as through an online poll, what facets of somebody's background and identity matter to them, and then trying to create small group discussions so that they are not alone representative of that identity or background. When I interviewed students, they often said that just having one other person whose eyes they could look into, who understood, took the burden off of their shoulders in these conversations. Students also really benefited from having a mentor who they could debrief with. So even if you're having this conversation among adults, having somebody who is a respected and trusted colleague or mentor who can debrief with them afterward and check in. And finding ways of representing viewpoints in the room that may not be represented in the room. And I'd be happy to talk about all of this in detail. But in conclusion, I think it's important to see that the polarization about polarization may be undermining our ability to hold civil discourse in a way that is inclusive and beneficial for all people. The way in which we tend to be divided on whether dialogue across political differences is harmful or helpful can make it hard to see the way these conversations are beneficial, but can also be harmful, right? And so I think that we solve that not only by trying to change and improve the structure of these conversations, but also by getting good at listening to communication outside of dialogue. So not advocating or insisting upon civil discourse at all times, but also listening closely to the expression of grievance through activism, such as through protest, boycotts, lawsuits, etc., understanding the importance of multiple forms of democratic participation, as well as by listening for when dialogue may not be appropriate. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. This was great and very interrelated. I want to just note one thing, that the doctrine of discovery, it seems, is so central to our history, and yet, as you mentioned in your book, it's so unknown and so not studied. But I was thinking about it in the context of not only American history, but if you think about the doctrine of discovery over time, it's really, in some ways, a history of both imperialism and colonization. And we see it particularly in an American context, as you point out, this notion of you have a worldview that provides, an excuse and allows one to other and dehumanize other people in an effort for conquest is, so central. And the fact that we don't know more about it is, I think, telling as a part of the myth of America. So that is just one point that I really took away from the book. The other point, Rachel, relating to you is, obviously, as we're going through the real history of the United States, people do want to hang on to its aspiration, its values, its hope, and yet wrestling with the past and how to reconcile our values and our hope for our country has provided for some, it's threatening. It's a status threat. It's a threat to their religious beliefs, even if they're not practicing. It's a threat to where they thought their place was in the country. And so having those kinds of difficult conversations while we're diversifying so quickly as a nation, while coming to grips with our past, the good, the bad, and the ugly, it seems to me something that is keeping us stuck politically, culturally, and in so many ways. And I was just wondering if you guys could, now that I've said all of these things, comment on a few of them.
Good. After you.
So
the doctrine of discovery is that's so central to all of this.
So Paige, are you wanting me to comment on the way in which discussions over how and whether we teach history get us stuck?
I think the question is, if you think about how we are framing our history in some ways, some people feel threatened, some people feel blamed, some people feel angry, fury. I mean, you've seen that. And you have Trump, but others in the Republican Party give voice to that. And how do we begin to sort of honor our founding values and our founding principles while dealing with, in some ways, a very, very barbaric past and the doctrine of discovery in a way that's forward-looking and benefits the country, as opposed to what it's doing now, which is dividing the country pretty seriously.
Yeah, sure. So I think that a lot of people worry that if we try to have these conversations, that we are ceding ground on truth and justice. That if, say, a PTO or a school board was to invite people to discuss the history curriculum, and there was a discussion across, people on the left and the right, that we might, just by sitting down together, be saying, well, we're open to not teaching that the discovery doctrine existed, right? So we're not going to have that conversation because we know it's crucial to teach that history. And I think what's really important is that the willingness to have these conversations and to structure them in a way that is conducive to relationship building is not actually indicative of a willingness to cede ground on the substantive issues that matter. That one can recognize the necessity of working together with people who deeply disagree in order to get these instrumental goals accomplished, like having information about the discovery doctrine included in a history curriculum. And that I think what is effective, and not in any means surefire or panacea, because these conversations do not resolve these differences in any way, and nor should they, because these are important questions for a democracy to wrestle with and to fight over, actually. But these conversations open up the possibility for work that is not simply, I hope the other side loses at every turn. And I think structuring conversations that take into account the fact that we are animals with hopes and fears will make these conversations more productive. So I didn't have a chance to talk about the structure of these dialogues, but I think in the kind of conversation that you're talking about, where you're maybe inviting a school district or a school, families in a school to have these conversations, opening with something like, what scares you? What do you want for your children? What do you hope for? As well as opening with icebreakers that let people talk about themselves outside of their relationship to these issues. Talk about their roles as mothers and grandmothers and so forth, that are connecting outside of them. So I think that that's one way to move forward.
I'll jump in. I mean, we're a week away from a federal holiday that's going to bring these issues right to the fore, right? So next Monday is officially and historically been Columbus Day. But President Biden was the first sitting president to declare it Indigenous Peoples Day. Now there are, I think, there are more than a dozen states. There are nearly 200 cities that have also declared the day Indigenous Peoples Day as well. But that link is exactly what we're talking about. Like, who are we, right? What's our story? And if we link it to Columbus, right, it is a direct link to this old doctrine of discovery, colonizer attitude. That's what comes along for the ride there. If we focus it on Indigenous people, I think it helps us kind of think, okay, what it does, I think, in that case, is it points us to the ongoing work of an incomplete democracy, right? That we and I think that's a healthier thing. There's a kind of triumphalism that I think comes from the Columbus Day narrative, and I think that's exactly what we're seeing is the challenge of a kind of impossibly innocent mythology right, in America, and that passes for patriotism in the country. And so I think the challenge and the conflict actually is quite a healthy thing, even though I think it's very uncomfortable. But it's only through this conflict, right, that statues to the Confederacy come down. It's only through this conflict that we get a president who's willing to use the words white supremacy, for example, in a speech. Biden's also the first person to ever do that in a speech, and willing to kind of declare Indigenous Peoples Day, on what is traditionally been celebrated as Columbus Day. So I think, and Biden did both. I think that's a real indication of where we are, right? So he made a declaration of Independence Day, and he turned right around and made a declaration for Columbus Day. And I think that is really indicative of where we are in this, in this struggle. And part of it, Paige, as you said, it is about the changing demographics in the country. And just to kind of put a fine point on it, it's only been the last 20 years that we have moved from being a majority white Christian country to one that's no longer a majority white Christian country. So beginning of Barack Obama's presidency, country is 54% white and Christian. Today it's 42% white and Christian. So that's a real sea change culturally, religiously, and the kind of lock on power has always been in this country, not just racial, it's been ethno-religious, right? It's always been a kind of white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant Christian view of who should be kind of the proper Americans in that mythology. And that's the vision that's being kind of deconstructed, challenged, by these new narratives, and frankly, by the new majority of Americans.
I'll just say, some people want to make it a zero-sum game. Some people want to make it additive. And in some ways, that's part of the tension. Anyway, Patricia, let's open it up.
You got it. Okay, so Morris has presented a question that is similar to something that I would love to hear from both of you about, Dr. Jones, from your perspective of having looked at history, and Dr. Wahl, your perspective of having looked at the history also, but also speaking with a lot of young people. So I think that brings a slightly different perspective from what our audience might be used to. And that's about emotion. So Morris is asking is some of the problem that people don't want their children to be told to feel guilty. There's a lot, you all have talked about fear, you've talked about indoctrination, and these all strike me as emotional attachments that are systematically created through culture, right? Through culture, whether the culture be religious or the culture be something else. So what, Dr. Jones, I'd love to hear from you first. Did you see any of that, or how much and how did that show up in what you saw in the exploration of the history? And then Dr. Wahl, you've already spoken a lot to this, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the things what you hear in the dialogues among younger people.
Yeah. Well, I was struck. So whether I was in the Mississippi Delta or in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Duluth, Minnesota, but talking to the people who were like working on the ground. So like in the Mississippi Delta, it was a group of people who got together, who realized that, as recently as 2000, if you had, the whole world knew Emmett Till's name, and as this kind of, one of the kind of important sparks that ignited the modern civil rights movement. But if you had gone to Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, where it all went down, there was virtually nothing telling that story on the ground. In as recently as 2000, and a group got together and said, look, we've got to tell the truth about this. We've just covered it up in our local history. It's a huge sore spot between Black and white residents here. And we've never apologized to the Till family for what happened here. And so that was the initial impetus. And what was remarkable, I think, was watching, again, this very rural, very small place. There were descendants of enslaved people and sharecroppers on the one hand, and there were descendants of plantation owners and enslavers on the other. And because it's a rural place, people know each other, and they not only know each other, they know like what their grandparent did to my grandparent. Like, those kinds of stories are still there. And yet, the main leader, the kind of central leader, is a woman named Betty Bobo Pearson, and Bobo. That name is an old planter name in the Mississippi Delta. All right, and she was leading the charge, which meant telling some uncomfortable stories about her own family. But she did it, I think, not to feel bad or to feel guilty, but she did it because she was convinced that if they didn't tell the truth about it, there was no hope for a better future There's no hope for any honest place to stand. And I think that's what really motivated her there. And just one more quick comment on the kind of people feeling uncomfortable. That's actually written into some of these anti-critical race theory bills, this idea about making children uncomfortable, but it's always written from the perspective of a white child feeling uncomfortable, right? There's no mention of, well, what if an African-American child's in the class and there's no mention of slavery, or it's mentioned, as it was in Florida, that there were some benefits to enslaved people for being enslaved, or an indigenous person who's there, who's barely mentioned at all in the story, despite the fact on every map you look around, there are indigenous river names, county names, city names, all around them, and yet that history is never talked about. So I'm very impatient with that sort of, about like white children are the only ones who are focused on about not feeling comfortable or feeling uncomfortable in these conversations.
Yeah, in terms of the concern specifically about children in schools feeling upset learning this history, pedagogy matters, and it matters, I think, especially in these kinds of discussions. And I think that educators who are trying to teach this difficult history emphasize developmentally appropriate, is the term, developmentally appropriate history curricula, right? And so, do we want 6-year-olds to be exposed to the details of death camps like Auschwitz? No. But do we want to teach about the Holocaust? Yes. Right. And there's not really a debate about whether children should learn that the Holocaust happened. Well, there is, but it's not a mainstream debate. And I think similarly, finding developmentally appropriate ways to teach excruciatingly painful history is a crucial part of history and social studies education. And it's something that history and social studies educators, as well as scholars in these fields, put a lot of time and energy into doing. And so I think that we need to get better at validating parents' concerns for their children and sharing how educators in this field are trying to respond to them, right? Because actually, 4th grade teachers are not saying, well, screw you, it doesn't matter if your child gets upset. They're saying, I care a lot about the children in this classroom, and we're training you to teach in a way that is considerate of the fact that these are fragile human beings.
Thank you both. So the next question is a tough one. It's about facts. And I am a former social studies teacher, high school social studies teacher, and I know, that everybody has their own perspective. How do you engage in these conversations? Where does the agreement on the same set of facts come in, or does it?
Yeah, luckily, it really doesn't matter if people agree on the same set of facts for these conversations. There are other kinds of conversations where it matters a lot, like structured deliberation, where you're trying to come to a decision about a political issue preceding a vote, for example. But the kinds of conversations I'm talking about are really aimed at shifting relationships. They're really not aimed at changing people's view of a political issue. So in most of the conversations that I observed, particularly the ones around Pennsylvania and New Jersey, the moderators started out saying, we're not here to engage in fact wars. This is not about persuading you that my facts are better than your facts. And while a common way of determining truth from falsehood may be important to the long-term health of our democracy, it is not the job of these conversations, nor is it necessary for these conversations to go well. This is really about understanding the humanness of the person who disagrees with you about politics, not trying to convince them that their facts are wrong.
That's a really interesting distinction. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Wahl. Dr. Jones, would you say more about your experience in observing, for example, in Mississippi? I was struck by the example you gave where you spoke about truth, and it reminded me of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa. So would you say more about truth and facts and how that impacts impacts folks in conversations like this?
Yeah, I think one thing that sets kind of my research apart, or just in a different space, is that half the battle and the purpose of the people coming together was to establish a shared set of facts, right? That there had been this disputed history, denials of, like in Tulsa, for example, is really remarkable that the head of the Tulsa Historical Society, as late as the 1980s, like the president of the Tulsa Historical Society, was denying that the Tulsa Race Massacre even occurred, right? And was saying, "Oh no, those were Mexicans and Indians that created that violence. It wasn't white people, right?" It's like it wasn't denying the violence happened, but denying the perpetrators. And so that was like from the official, Tulsa Historical Society. So there was a lot of work that had to be done. But I think one of the things that helps in these cases that these are local stories, and there are local dialogues, and they're people who, if they don't know each other, know somebody knows somebody. They're those kind of tight knit communities, and they're on the ground. So there are things you can like look at you can pull up the microfiche. You can go to the county archives. You can people can tell their own family stories. There are those kinds of resources that I think help people work it through. And certainly people came to these conversations with different assumptions, different stories that they had heard through the white community versus the Black community, for example, or the indigenous community. Those are very different assumptions coming in. But I think this idea that I think one of the challenges with dialogue in the abstract is that it just floats free of any groundedness, right? But in these cases, they were all grounded in a local community's history, so that everybody had something at stake in the outcome. I think there were also ways to verify things, and they weren't just kind of floating out there. It wasn't just dialogue floating out there in the ether. I mean, they were really about a very specific thing that in a community that they all shared. I think that actually makes a difference as well. Certainly if you're talking about like some debate on Facebook or social media, right, where there's just no relationship, there's no groundedness, and then it just spins off into crazy land with people citing my facts versus your facts. But I think on the ground, I think it's why more of these efforts really make a difference. If we can get more of these kinds of efforts on happening on the ground, there I think we do see people kind of shift their views over time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've done other research on different kinds of dialogue, such as dialogue between police and communities. And when you're trying to shift either an institution or a set of practices, everything I'm talking about is really, really different. So you need sustained dialogue over time. You need really concrete outcomes and change processes that everybody agrees upon at the beginning. And these kind of one-off conversations that are sort of floating in the ether aren't going to work, right? If you're actually trying to change institutional practices or shift, in this case, an understanding of history, it's a really different process, and that's important.
Dr. Jones, what role, if any, did you observe organized religion playing in conversations and reviews of the history?
Yeah, well, it was, it's interesting that organized religion played roles both in the commission and covering up of many of these acts of racial violence in the past. But it also played some roles in, kind of unpacking it. It played roles in people staying at the table when they wanted to walk away. I think that was something kind of just in terms of commitment and resilience to kind of very challenging, conversations that took place over, in some cases, like in Mississippi, process was a couple of decades long, right? And people walked away, they came back a year later. I mean, it was that kind of thing, going on. But I think that the woman, just to stay with the example I gave, the woman's name, Betty Bobo Pearson, certainly drew on her faith, like as a reason for staying in the conversation, even when it was really, really hard. So I think, we've seen both of these things that it's played a kind of divisive role. But I think in other ways, it's played a role of people coming together and helping them kind of have the resilience to stay in very difficult conversations.
Great. Dr. Walden, was there anything you wanted to add to that before I turn it back to Paige?
Religion played a pretty involved role. It's not a quick answer.
Fair enough. That says it all, doesn't it? Paige, that's just about the last of the questions from the audience. Did you have more that you'd like to ask?
I do. If you think about the two processes that you were talking about, both of you, sort of coming to grips with the contradictions inherent in some of our founding principles and thoughts about ourselves as a country and a people, with our history, and with trying to reconcile, the founding principles and a brutal history. It seems to me that what we're seeing now is some of the difficult conversations and the difficult feelings that are being evoked are actually being weaponized by some to gain political power, and sort of like pouring gasoline on the discomfort around the changing nature of the United States in terms of its populace, and also the changing nature of our understanding about ourselves as a people. And I mean, I think you're seeing that in state legislatures. I think you're seeing that obviously in the House and the Senate. And so how do we address something that can, lead the country to a better place, not only, in the United States, but globally, versus, arguing against or fighting against those who would weaponize this for their own political power?
Well, I'll jump in. I actually think we have to fight those that are going to weaponize this for their own political power, right? I'm all for civility and dialogue, but we've never had social change in this country without conflict, and I think we're going to have to kind of pay attention to that lesson from history and be there. But and it's notable that it's a game plan, right? So there are only about 12 states, I think last time I checked, that do not have a bill that's been introduced in the state legislature denouncing critical race theory and aiming to limit what's taught in particularly K through 12 schools, but sometimes higher education, as we're seeing in Florida as well. So that's a real challenge, right? And that's all about preserving what is, very much a history that has glorified the majority, that has marginalized other voices. And again, it just is this impossibly innocent and kind of naive, version of history that I think, we're better. I'm thinking of this quote. I'll end with this. I was able to go to the reception at the Department of Interior after President Biden just last month signed this legislation or proclamation that created a new national monument to Emmett Till. So it's going to be the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument. And at the signing, Vice President Kamala Harris spoke, and she said this. She said, "Let us not be seduced that we'll be better if we forget. We'll be better if we remember, and we'll be stronger if we remember." And I think that's just fundamentally true. And those of us who agree with that are going to have to kind of stand up and remind us that we're strong enough to handle it. Really, that we can tell a truer story about ourselves is not going to make us weaker. In fact, it's going to build a stronger foundation for us to go forward, with everybody together.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that I think part of fighting is not giving up on persuasion, not assuming that the cause is already lost and all we can do is try to annihilate the other side. I think that there are moments for that. There are moments in which unequivocal fights for justice are what matters, where protest and boycott and legal action is what is the right thing to do. But I think there are also times in which there are ways to be persuasive that rely on the continued humanity and continued thinking capacity of people who are on the other side of these issues, and that we shouldn't entirely give up on that, particularly because we care about the result.
Well, on that hopeful note, both of you, thank you so much. This is really, really a fascinating conversation, and I think so central to what we will be experiencing as we think through what's going to happen in 2024. There are going to be a lot of competing interests, a lot of hard conversations, and a lot of weaponizing. So thank you very much.